Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Divorce and Separation Coach podcast. Today, we're talking about economic abuse, and it's a concept that's come up more lately, but up until recently, domestic abuse was really seen as domestic violence, physical violence. And there has been an increase in awareness lately around other forms of abuse, like coercive control. And one of those types of abuse within coercive control is economic abuse. And so today I wanted us to dive a little bit deeper to understand what economic abuse is, how it manifests itself, but also what you can do to address it if it comes up in particular in the context of your divorce. So to talk about this, I've invited Helen Greenfield. Helen is a family lawyer and a mediator, and she advises her clients on all matters relating to family breakdown, to separation, and cohabitation. Helen has a particular interest in helping those affected in domestic abuse. And I think, Helen, is because you recognize that there's so much more than just the legal implications. There's all those emotions and other issues that come into play. And it really is about supporting your clients through that entire process. So thank you so much for joining us.
No, thanks for having me.
So can we start maybe by just defining what we're talking about? So how is economic abuse defined, and how does it typically manifest itself in particular during divorce?
Yeah, I mean, as you said earlier, it is now recognized that it's domestic abuse and not domestic violence. So it used to be, people only got listened to if they could walk in and say, look at my black eye, this is what my partner did to me. And it is a lot more nuanced than that. And luckily, the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 has defined it now, and it's a legally recognized form of domestic abuse, economic abuse, along with a lot of other things like sexual abuse and psychological abuse. But economic abuse is defined as any behavior that has a substantial and adverse effect on an individual's ability to either do things like acquire, use, or maintain money or other property. So things like controlling people's mobile phones or cars can be economic abuse, or the ability to sort of obtain goods, buy stuff like food, clothing, or services. Often things like utilities, like heating and things, can be controlled in this way. So it's much bigger than just, oh, I'm not giving you your, allowance this month. It's much more widespread. And a lot of it is controlling spending, bank accounts, bills, borrowing, but also access to things like I said earlier, like transport and technology. Yeah. So it then affects the individual's ability to work, stay connected to the outside, their support networks, things, as well as just doing the daily things like eating and clothing yourselves. Yeah. And then, horribly, I've had cases where it can also include things like partners destroying stuff and then refusing to give them the money to replace them. So, it's very insidious and can get into all aspects of relationships.
But effectively, what it means is that there's one of the two who is in a situation of dependency towards the other to be able to manage money in the way you'd expect an adult to be able to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's one of those...
Sorry, go ahead.
I think it's one of those things when you don't have the access to it, and when that starts happening, you almost don't believe it. And sometimes I think people, like you said, if you're dependent on someone, if you're, say, the homekeeper and are reliant on the other person's income, if that stops, I think some people feel, well, that's my fault. I'm not doing anything to earn this money, so maybe I shouldn't be so greedy. And it starts like that, and then it just gets worse and worse and worse. And it's a lack of a partnership, and someone's using their power to create a huge power imbalance.
And I've seen it with some of my clients for whom they've always operated that way in their marriage, so they don't even think of it as a problem. It's just how they've done things, and it's once they get to divorce that actually they realize that it's a real issue because they don't have access to any money for themselves. They don't have that independence that they should be having, at that age.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. That is why it goes unseen for quite so long. Because even nowadays, when clients come and see me, it's often the case that one of the parties has less of an idea how the finances are working than the other. And sometimes that's not an insidious thing. It's just how they've agreed to run stuff.
Yeah.
But sometimes, people suddenly think, really, that's my life? And they, the word abuse hasn't even crossed their mind until they've sat down with the third party.
So what kind of protections are there within the law to help people who are suffering from this kind of abuse?
Okay, well, the Domestic Abuse Act doesn't make it a crime in its own right, but it really does highlight that the police and other agencies should be more aware of it. But it can be considered under the offence of coercive and controlling behaviour, which
Yeah.
is now a crime. And
Okay.
it became a crime December 2015. So, that is something that can now be reported to the police, and more is starting to be recognised, and people are charged with it.
Yeah. And then within the civil arena of family court, how does it get recognized, and what role does it play, especially with the financial elements?
That's a good question, and one that the family courts are grappling with, I would say. Now, it's not something that has been a huge part of the family law world, really. In financial proceedings, you can raise the issue of conduct. So you can
Okay.
say conduct should be recognised because this, and this has happened to me.
Okay.
Unfortunately, there is a really high bar for raising that. It's called the gasp factor. So it has to sort of make you go, oh, if someone says it to you. And unfortunately, because the culture is as it is now, and thankfully this is changing very slowly, but it has been that the economic abuse has not been recognised as something that makes you gasp, and therefore hasn't really been recognised and has gone unseen in financial proceedings. So
Got it. It's not, like coercive control in general is quite simple. It's a pattern of behavior rather than one shocking incident.
absolutely. And I think that's what's been missing. And that's why we were so pleased when coercive and controlling behavior came in as an offence, because suddenly everyone woke up to the fact that actually this is a thing and this is abuse. And it's not just someone walking in with a black eye. It's
Exactly.
this psychological, as you say, drip, drip, drip approach that can pull people away from, it's really life-changing.
Absolutely. So there's been a lot of changes also in terms of different policies, and there's been a lot of talk in general lately around
Yes.
economic abuse. So they
Yeah.
were CAFCASS, which is the civil agency that takes care of protecting children in the family court, and they represent the children. They issued a new domestic abuse practice policy. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what's changed in that respect?
Yeah, I mean that's another area where domestic abuse it's been lacking. People haven't talked, as you say, talked about it, and it's not part of the culture. Again, physical abuse was always high up on the agenda, but this insidious, corrosive, controlling, more psychological, economic abuse has been missed.
Yeah.
But luckily, I think it was last month, CAFCASS published their new practice policy that they're trying to get all their sort of the children's guardians and the family court advisors all to comply with. So it should protect the adult victims of domestic abuse as well as their children.
Oh,
Because
brilliant.
their job in the courts is to advise about the welfare of the child and the child's best interests, and it shouldn't go unnoticed if there's domestic abuse involved. So they're requiring them all to go and do proper trainings on it.
Yeah.
They're also trying to change their language. So they're
Yeah.
trying to prevent them saying things like they claim or they allege in reports to court, using sort of the words that the children like saying, I have been abused, rather than
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So they can better determine the facts. And then also it's part of statute that every child should have a quality relationship with both parents. The caveat to that being if there is a risk of harm. The problem being, I think the pendulum swung a bit too far that way. So it was presumed that they would always have contact with each parent. They've changed in this policy slightly. So things like if they're being investigated for a sexual offence, or there's a significant risk of harm to the child thought about, then it should be the presumption that they do not spend time with that parent. So it just swings the pendulum back a bit.
So not contact at all costs, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think that was the problem. It was always thought it's much better. They're still your mum and dad. Let's make sure you still got a relationship with them. Whereas now I think we're learning that isn't always the case. And they've got to think harder about it, basically. But it's just good that everyone's they're all talking about it, and they're really trying to work out a way whereby they can continue to do the job they're doing, but do it even better, basically.
Have they widened their definition of domestic abuse as well in that new policy?
Yeah, I mean, they again are using the Domestic Abuse Act, which says it's not just physical violence, it's all the economic and the psychological and all of that as well. So yeah, I think that's the thing that started the ball rolling, and then everyone has stepped up really, and everyone's got to work together to protect victims of domestic abuse.
Exactly. And really understand its subtleties, because it's not
Yeah,
easy.
exactly, and that's the word.
Yeah. And so just at the same time as CAFCASS released their new policy, there was also a groundbreaking report that came out from Resolution, which is one of the leading organizations for solicitors, family law solicitors in the UK. And what did that report highlight, and how did it change the way we approach things?
So that was back to financial proceedings. So they were looking at domestic abuse and financial remedy proceedings. And I think it was something really awful, like 80% of professionals, that they did a survey, and 80% of professionals believe that domestic abuse, and actually specifically economic abuse, is not sufficiently taken into account in financial remedy proceedings. So like I was saying earlier, the gasp factor just isn't there. He wouldn't let me have 20 quid to go to the shop, isn't going to make you gasp, but drip, drip, drip over time, awful, and really does everything that all the other types of abuse do to you after a while. So I think the other things that came out of that report were legal aid. There's lack of availability for it. And again, economic abuse. If you can't afford a solicitor and your partner is refusing to fund one, how the hell do you make sure you're okay? So they really were saying there needs to be a cultural shift. That was the sort of bottom line of their report. They need to get all professionals, almost the starting point needs to be, is there domestic abuse? Well, how do we fit this in?
Yeah.
They're talking about changes to sort of getting a bit more technical, but the family procedurals, they have a part of it called the overriding objective, which kind of dictates how you run the case from the very start. So, one of their objectives within that is to deal with a case justly, and they're sort of saying that should include ensuring the parties are safeguarded from domestic abuse. It should just go. It should just cover everything. It should be in everything because it's so prevalent.
Yeah. Good point, actually.
Yeah. So it was really a very overarching report that basically said this is really not good, but we need to get everyone involved, including the judiciary. It needs to go from top to bottom. So they need to know, and things like, getting an order in the first place, but then if you get an order and it's not being followed, the enforcement side of it needs to be better. They need to be able to push perpetrators to do what they've been ordered to do, which at the moment is not that easy. And, perpetrators continue their abuse through proceedings often for that very reason.
It's worse during separation and afterwards. And legal abuse, actually, you just kind of touched on that. That is also a form of economic abuse, because you're forcing someone to spend and spend and spend on lawyers and going to court. Aside for the emotional turmoil that creates, it can be really stressing financially.
Exactly. And, the other option is to do it yourself. Well, you don't want to do that if you're faced with the person who's, abusing you. Impossible. So, really important.
So does this report just issue recommendations, or are there actual concrete actions that are going to come out of it right now?
No, it doesn't have a final recommendation or anything, but they're continuing to consider it. I mean, the good thing is people are talking about it, and they're talking about, it started off, people were talking about it in the wider world. I remember someone saying to me, well, people don't get domestically, it's all only people who live on council estates that have, rubbish. Rubbish.
Yeah.
It's in all stratas of society, all ethnicities, all, economic groups, everyone. It's a hideously high number. So it's really important that it's talked about as an overarching problem, but also within these family proceedings, because it affects everyone. I've had many clients say to me, but they're not listening. It's not I'm not getting justice here. And I always have to say to them, that's not what this is about. This is getting out the other end with the finances. Domestic
Yeah,
abuse has nothing to do with it. And it's an awful thing to hear if you've been at the end,
for
the wrong
sure.
end of an abusive relationship. It's really hard to hear that.
And it manifests itself a lot during divorce, in particular around the financial disclosure process.
Oh,
Usually if there
yeah.
is that kind of imbalance,
Mm,
the person who is, in control of the finances doesn't want to fill it for me. They don't want to
yeah,
have
of course.
to be
Yeah.
accountable. So how does that get handled?
Well, people like you, Chloe, I think, are very useful in that. Because
Yeah,
I think it's really daunting for people, if they haven't had anything to do or not been allowed to have anything to do with their finances, to suddenly have a massive form put in front of you and fill it
yeah,
in, and you have no idea. I mean, so yeah, I think it's not just a lawyer thing, actually. It's always
I agree.
really good to get third parties in to try and help with that stuff, because as you say, whilst it's filling in a spreadsheet, it's not. There's loads of emotion that goes with it. So I found with clients, you have to be realistic as to what to expect them to do. So some people you can just say, fill in this form, I'll speak to you next week. Some people you have to be very, just do that bit and then we can talk about it, do the next bit next week or whatever. And I think you have to be very clear about the best way to communicate with them. I
Yeah,
found with a lot of my victim survivor clients, almost an email just is awful. They can't take it all in. So it's almost
yeah,
send them an email and then say, I will ring you and then we'll go through it together.
yeah.
It's working out the best way to communicate. And yeah, sort of just explaining the point of it so they know why they're being forced to do it. It's not another, I think they feel sort of shame, guilt, and they don't want to relive everything every 5 minutes. So you've got to think of a way of doing it that they just don't have to. And I think framing it almost as a way that they can take back control. So
Yeah,
say,
yeah,
look, this is you getting back on your own 2 feet and you starting I hate this word, but the journey towards being okay again. This is
yeah.
the first step. So
And building the skill to be able to operate on their own later on as well.
exactly. So I think it's
And
really important.
it can be very overwhelming. I mean, the Form E is an intimidating document to start
Ugh,
with.
and it's a
But
horrible thing.
as you were saying, there's an element of embarrassment of, how do I not
Mm,
know this stuff?
exactly.
And it can be really uncomfortable. So taking it step by step, starting with the bit they do know, working
Yeah,
your way through it little by little. And I work also with some financial planners who help educate people and teach them those hard skills to
exactly.
manage a budget going forward.
Yeah. I mean, there's other things. I mean, I think banks are quite good at helping. If you really don't know any information, you can get in touch with banks. I've had clients do that in the past, and sort of they can help you find out some of the information because they've
I
got
never knew
some.
that. That's great.
Yeah, they've got a code that they've got to follow. So they're committed to sort of inform people who've
Mhm.
experienced domestic abuse, including economic abuse. So they can sort of tell them about assets and liabilities. I mean, it's got to be in their name, but it might be
Yeah,
that they don't know they've signed up to a loan or something, and the
yeah,
bank can tell them that stuff. So I think if you call the vulnerable customer team, they tend to be quite good at
can help. Oh,
helping
that's
you.
great.
Yeah. And then I think similarly, I've got people checking up their credit score and stuff, because then
Yeah.
that way you can find out whether there's other stuff that's been taken out in your name that you might not know about. So it's sort of trying to think outside the box, I think.
Yeah, and I guess that there's also forensic accountants that can be used. There's quite a few resources out there to
Yeah,
try and gather the information to start with.
yeah.
I'm going to ask you a question that I'm sure you've seen coming, and that is always the tricky one. Non-court dispute resolution,
Oh, yeah,
whether
yeah.
it's mediation or private FDR, whatever option they choose, collaborative law, etc. How do you handle that situation when you've got somebody who's being abused economically to make sure that they can leverage those options without having to go to court?
Yeah.
Or
I
can you
mean,
not?
yeah. Well, no, absolutely, and I think it's great. The again, things are shifting away from everything's got to go through court now to they're trying to push you out of court actually and think about a better way of doing this. So, and it used to be mediation only, which a lot of domestically abused, victim survivors think, I am not sitting around a table with this person, even if it's a metaphorical table. I don't want to. I'm not having a discussion with them.
Yeah.
Fair enough. But now, as you say, there are other things like private FDRs, or arbitration, that are really good processes, but they're not quite as maybe dynamic and directly involved with the other party as maybe mediation might be. So I think it's really good because, as we said earlier, the court process can be used against victim survivors in the worst possible way. If you don't comply with deadlines, it carries on and on and on. Solicitors' letters, you're bombarded by them, it just carries on the abuse. These processes, and I think now the fact that the family procedure rules are promoting them, and there are cost consequences if you just outright deny and say, I'm not doing them, really help this, because you can pull yourself out of the court proceedings into one of these processes, and it's quicker, it's much more controlled. So, you can be saying to the arbitrator, this is happening, should it be? And they can get involved before anything's even come before them. I just think you can choose your tribunal. They will properly prepare. So even if you're not talking about the domestic abuse, they can be well aware of it and have that in their mind, much more so than a judge who's got 55 cases before them would, and I just, I think it's less expensive overall, usually, even though sometimes people bulk at the fact, well, you don't have to pay for a judge in court, but you do in an arbitration. Well, it's the one-off cost and then you are done, as opposed to months and months and months of solicitors' correspondence. So I really hope the mindset shift of the courts will really assist people in that. And I think everyone was very worried when they were talking about compulsory mediation, because it takes away the fact that mediation is meant to be voluntary anyway, but also
it's a difficult process to enforce.
So a victim survivor, that is, a lot of people do mediate with domestic abuse involvement, but I think being forced to do it without the right preparation and speaking to the right people can be, completely crippling to some people. So I think the fact that there's all these other things available now for victim survivors, and the courts are on board with it because they frankly have got too much to be doing. They'd be quite pleased if everyone went into NCDR. So, I just think it's a clear message from all sides now. So even if someone was refusing to do it, there would be consequences now, whereas there wouldn't have been before, which must be positive.
And I think you're right. The key is that there are so many NCDR options. It doesn't have to be one that makes you uncomfortable. There are some that offer the right degree of protection, the right form, so you don't feel re-victimized through that process.
Exactly. And that was and that's the worst thing. And I think that's the sort of the people who sort of say mediation is great for everyone, including those victim survivors. I think they would say that's them taking back control. And I think there's a bit of that in all the NCDR processes, that you are involved to an extent. So it's on that journey to readdressing the power imbalance, I think.
Absolutely. So to kind of wrap up, I like to ask my guests to share tips. So if you could share 3 tips, if somebody is trying to get divorced, but they've been a victim of economic abuse, what would be your 3 tips to them?
I think definitely look into and try and get a really good recommend of a support. So a solicitor, even if it start with a solicitor, like yourself, a divorce coach, or someone in that arena who can point you in the right direction. Because I think some people don't even, as we said before, don't even realize that they're in an abusive relationship. But talking to a third party, the penny drops. And then the whole dynamic of this thing changes, I think. So I think it is trying to not, and I know it's really easy for me to say, and I realize it's an expensive thing to do, but there are more, more or less expensive people to talk to. But I just think getting even if it's a one-off meeting, and it's not going to be ongoing, I think that's really worth doing, because I think it lays the land. And I think then you go into the process more informed. Then know your rights, and and also someone might name it for you then, that it is abuse, and you need to be thinking about it. I think the other one is not related at all. This is in no particular order, but I think it's gathering, there's a lot of gathering of stuff. So I think it's sort of taking your time to do all of that, gathering all your documents. I've had clients who have found it hard to do that because, their partner's taken it all, or they're no longer in the house, so they've moved it. So just taking photos of stuff is useful. And there are apps, I think, that you can do it without saving it on your device. There's a thing called a Bright Sky app, I think, where you can take a photo and it won't save it onto your device. So it won't be seen by anyone else, So that said, be careful. You're not allowed to go around doing that of your partner's things, but your things, if that's going to be a worry for you. And just one step at a time. And I think the final bit for me, and I had a client that I had to have this conversation with only on Monday this week. Things don't happen immediately overnight in this arena.
Yes.
So and it's easy again to say, but don't panic. If someone says something to you, I'm going to divorce you, it's not going to happen that day. It's not going to happen that week even. So try and, take a beat really and think, right, they've said that, I will speak to someone in the morning. My poor lady that I was speaking to was sort of texting me on Sunday, oh my God, this and this has happened. And I don't like texting clients on Sundays. But I just texted her back and said, take a breath, we'll speak on Monday. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen overnight. So I think it's just, as I say, take a beat, take a breath. It will get sorted. It will be a crappy 6 months, a year while you get through. You'll get out the other end and things will be far improved. So you've just got to, take a breath. It's so easy to say when you're not living it.
Of course, but it's a good piece of advice because it's true, it does take time. Everything seems very urgent when you're in the eye of the storm.
Oh, it does.
Actually, it rarely really is.
Yeah, and I think abusers love that they can sort of say, I'm going to do this tomorrow. Well, they're not,
Yeah, yeah. So three really good tips. So first of all, to seek the right kind of support, and depending on the size of your wallet, but there's always people there who can help of all sorts. You mentioned banks and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Second of all, to take bite-sized pieces.
Yes.
As you're going, take your time. There's little, you don't have to fill out your Form E overnight. Just start with what you know. And then the last one is to accept that it's going to take a little bit of time. And actually that means that you have time to process and to deal with these issues.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, in all of that, it's getting people have got friends and family, but getting the therapeutic support in the background as well is really important because you've got to do you as well as everything else.
Yeah.
So.
And your life doesn't stop because you're going through this. So
sadly, no.
You still have to juggle it all.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Helen. This was a really interesting conversation.
Really
I think it'll give a lot of information to people who, as you say, don't always realize that they're victims of economic abuse. No. But even for those who do realize, just knowing where to start, what to do about it, and that they do have rights and that they're getting more and more protections.
Absolutely.
So you're aware of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Helen. You have a great day.
Thanks, Chloe. You too.